The day Marshal Hunter rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1873, he did not look like a man who had anything left to lose, because he had already lost everything worth keeping and had made a deliberate, careful peace with that emptiness. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail, a rough and ambitious little place that smelled of cattle and leather, and the particular kind of desperation that settles over a frontier settlement trying to convince itself it has a future. The main street was a wide, rutted stretch of packed earth lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon called the Dusty Crown, a livery, a small church that leaned slightly to the east as if trying to escape itself, and the jailhouse where Marshal Hunter had been sent to restore some version of order after the previous marshal had been shot dead over a card game 3 weeks prior. Hunter was 32 years old and looked 40. Not in the way that men look old from hard living and careless habits, but in the way that men look old when they have seen too much and chosen to stop feeling about it. He had dark hair that had gone gray at the temples, pale gray eyes the color of a winter sky with nothing promising behind it, and a jaw that seemed to have been set in concrete sometime around 1865 and never relaxed since. He carried himself with a kind of deliberate stillness that people mistook for confidence, when really it was simply the absence of anything urgent enough to move for. He had come back from the war between the states 8 years prior, a man unrecognizable to himself. He had fought for the Union, had marched through Georgia with Sherman, had seen things that a man's mind was never designed to hold without breaking somewhere along the seam. When he came back to Ohio, where his family's farm sat beside a quiet creek, he found that the farm was still there, but the quiet was gone from inside him, and he could not seem to find it again no matter how long he sat beside that creek. His younger brother Thomas had stayed home. A childhood fever had taken his hearing, and the army had refused him. And Thomas had married a girl named Ruth, and they had 2 small children, and the farm was doing well enough, and there was simply no room in that picture for a man who flinched at the sound of a door slamming and could not sleep more than 2 hours together. He had buried things. That was the only way he had found to keep moving. Every time some feeling rose in him that was too large or too soft or too dangerous, he put it in the ground and walked away from it. He buried the grief for his dead friends. He buried the guilt for the things he had done that the war had required of him. He buried whatever tenderness he had once been capable of. He remembered being capable of it, the way you remember a foreign language you studied as a child, knowing the shape of it without being able to speak it anymore. He buried longing and hope and the particular warmth that used to rise in him when he saw something beautiful, a sunset, a well-made saddle, the way a woman's hair looked when the light caught it right. He buried all of it, one careful shovelful at a time, until the surface of him was smooth and hard and nothing grew there. He had drifted west after Ohio, finding work as a deputy in one town and then another, discovering that his stillness made him good at the job, and that the job, in return, gave him enough forward motion to keep from thinking too hard about anything. He was good with a gun, better than good, precise in the way that men become precise when they stop caring about their own survival and simply focus on accuracy. He was not cruel. He was fair. He followed the law with the kind of rigid devotion that a man shows a religion when he has nothing else to believe in, and the law was something he could hold on to because it had clear edges and did not ask him to feel anything. It was Sheriff Denton Briggs who had hired him for Caldwell, a gray-haired man who ran the county from the town of Wellington 15 miles north, and who had no interest in getting shot for the sake of a cattle town. Briggs had offered Hunter a decent salary, a small house behind the jailhouse, and the understanding that the job would be difficult and the thanks would be minimal. Hunter had shaken his hand and ridden south without asking any further questions. He arrived on a Tuesday in late April, when the air still had a bite to it in the mornings, but the afternoons were warm enough that the dust rose off the street in little spirals. He stabled his horse, a big, Steady Roan he called Soldier, which was not a sentimental name but simply an accurate one, and walked the length of the main street once before going to the jailhouse, taking inventory of the place the way a man catalogs a problem he intends to solve methodically. He noticed Sarah Rourke on that first walk, though he did not know her name yet. She was standing outside the general store with a bolt of blue cotton fabric in her arms and an expression on her face that suggested she was engaged in a private disagreement with someone or something that was not present. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark auburn hair that had been pinned up under a faded calico bonnet, and brown eyes the warm color of Good Creek water in summer. She was wearing a plain dress that had been mended at the hem more than once, and her hands, he noticed, were the hands of a woman who worked strong and capable, a little roughened, with none of the careful softness that money bought. She glanced at him as he passed. He nodded, the way he nodded at every person on the street, a minimal acknowledgement, nothing more, and kept walking. He did not think about her again that day. He spent the afternoon making himself known at the jailhouse, reviewing the previous marshal's notes, which were sparse and unhelpful, and taking inventory of the weapons cabinet, which had a broken lock and contained a shotgun with a cracked stock and a box and a half of rifle cartridges. He introduced himself to his deputy, a young man named Cletus Farrow, who was 19 years old, freckled, and terrified of Hunter in the particular way that young men are terrified of silent older men who clearly know things about the world that the young men do not. Hunter was not unkind to Farrow. He simply gave him clear instructions and expected them to be followed, which Farrow seemed to find both reassuring and alarming in equal measure. The first week in Caldwell was straightforward enough. He dealt with two drunk cowboys from a trail drive who had broken up the Dusty Crown fairly thoroughly, a dispute between two homesteaders over a fence line that had gone on long enough to require his formal attention, and a horse thief who turned out to be a 15-year-old boy from a failing farm north of town, whom Hunter fed a meal and returned to his father with a quiet, firm warning that served as punishment enough. It was in the second week that he encountered Sarah Rourke properly. He had been walking to the general store to pick up a tin of coffee. He drank a great deal of coffee, it being one of the few pleasures he had not yet seen fit to bury, when he heard the argument from half a block away. Not an argument exactly. A one-sided confrontation, which was worse. A man named Cyrus Aldgate was standing in front of the store, blocking the doorway, and he was speaking to Sarah Rourke in the particular tone of a man who believes that what he wants ought to be delivered to him as a natural consequence of wanting it. Aldgate was a cattle broker, a florid, well-dressed man in his mid-40s who had money, and the habit of using it to explain why he was right about everything. Hunter learned later that Aldgate had been pressing his attentions on Sarah for the better part of a year. He had come by her farm, a small place 2 miles west of town that she ran alone, multiple times with offers that disguised themselves as help, but were really just different shapes of pressure. He wanted the farm, which sat on a good water source, and he wanted Sarah along with it, though he had a wife in Wichita who probably did not know about this particular interest. What Hunter saw in that moment was simply a large man blocking a woman's path and speaking to her in a tone that made the muscles in his jaw tighten. He stopped beside them. He did not reach for his gun. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, in the particular way he had of standing that communicated without any theatrics that he had arrived and intended to stay arrived. "Mr. Aldgate," he said. He had learned the man's name from Farrow, who had briefed him on the notable citizens of Caldwell with the enthusiasm of a young man who found local gossip irresistible. "Is there a problem here?" Aldgate turned and looked at Hunter with the expression of a man who has been interrupted mid-sentence by someone he has not yet decided to respect. "This is a private conversation, Marshal." "Miss Rourke," Hunter said, addressing her directly, ignoring Aldgate entirely. "Would you like to go inside?" She looked at him with those brown eyes, and there was something in them that he noticed without wanting to, a careful, measuring intelligence, and something underneath it that was almost amusement, as though she found the whole situation more absurd than frightening, and found him equally absurd for inserting himself into it. "Yes, thank you," she said. Aldgate moved. He had no real choice, with the marshal standing there, and he was the kind of man who knew how to calculate when a confrontation had turned against him. He stepped aside with a gracious smile that did not reach his eyes and said that there was no problem at all, just a friendly exchange, and tipped his hat to Sarah with an elaborate courtesy that managed to convey both retreat and threat at the same time. Sarah went inside. Hunter bought his coffee. When he was leaving, she was at the counter paying for her supplies, and she said, without turning around, "I did not need rescuing, Marshal." He stopped at the door. "No," he agreed. "You seem to be managing well enough." I just hurried up the conclusion. She did turn then, and that almost amusement was fully present now. "That is a diplomatic way of putting it." "I try," he said, which was not particularly true but seemed like the right thing to say, and he left. He thought about her on the walk back to the jailhouse. He noticed that he was thinking about her, and then he noticed himself trying to stop, and then he noticed with some irritation that stopping did not seem to be working. He put it aside. Or tried to. The trouble with Caldwell in the spring and summer of 1873 was that the cattle drives brought thousands of longhorns up the Kishom Trail from Texas. And with the cattle came the cowboys. And with the cowboys came all the accumulated tension of men who had been riding for weeks in the same clothes with the same companions, and had arrived at last at a place with liquor and gambling and a burning desire to make up for lost time. Most of it was manageable. Most cowboys were simply young men in need of a meal, a bath, a drink, and a good night's sleep. But the trail bosses were not always careful about who they hired, and the saloon kept long hours, and the combination produced, with reasonable regularity, the kind of trouble that required a marshal's attention. Hunter managed it steadily, without drama. He established early, through 2 or 3 necessary and precisely calibrated demonstrations of competence, that he was not a man to be tested, and after that the cowboys largely tested him less. He had a particular gift for de-escalation that came not from charm or warmth, but from a kind of absolute unflappability that made violence seem, in his presence, slightly absurd, like shouting at a stone wall and expecting it to argue back. He saw Sarah Rourke several more times in those first weeks. She came to town for supplies every week or so, and once he saw her at the church on a Sunday. He went to church not because he believed in it with any great conviction, but because a marshal's presence at Sunday service communicated something about stability that the town seemed to need. She sat 3 pews in front of him with an older woman he learned was her neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Haverson, and she sang the hymns in a clear, unself-conscious voice that he found difficult to stop listening to. He learned her story piecemeal, the way you learn things in a small town from Pharaoh, from the store owner whose name was Bert Calloway, from the casual conversations that people had within earshot of a lawman, because they tended to forget that lawmen had ears just like everyone else. Sarah Rourke had come to Caldwell 3 years earlier with her husband, a man named Daniel Rourke, who had brought her west from Missouri with big plans and a small amount of capital, and the particular bright-eyed ambition that the frontier inspired in certain men. The farm had been Daniel's dream, 40 acres of decent land with a good well, and the idea of cattle and wheat, and a future assembled from hard work and determination. Daniel had been a good man by all accounts, a kind man. He had worked the farm with Sarah through 2 difficult years, and then he had gotten sick, a fever that came in the summer of 1871, and took him in 10 days, as fevers did in that time and place, with a casualness that was heartbreaking in its ordinariness. Sarah had stayed. This was the part of her story that people told with the particular respect that the frontier reserved for stubbornness. She had buried her husband on the farm. In the ground he had broken himself, and she had decided that leaving would be a betrayal of something, though exactly what that something was, only she knew. She was 23 at the time of Daniel's death. She had no children. The pregnancy she had been carrying when they arrived had ended in a quiet grief that Daniel had borne with her, and there had been no second one before he died. She was alone on the farm, and she had chosen to stay, and she had made it work through what sounded like a combination of intelligence, physical toughness, and a refusal to accept that the situation was as impossible as it looked. She hired a hand sometimes, when she could afford it, an old Mexican man named Ezra who came and went as work required, and she had learned to do the things that needed doing, and Calloway extended her credit with a generosity he probably could not afford, and Mrs. Haverson brought her food when the winter was hard, and she made it. She was making it still. Hunter found this information accumulating inside him with a feeling he could not quite name and did not try to. He found himself paying attention when she was in town in a way that he was not entirely comfortable with, because attention led to caring and caring led to the kind of soft places he had worked very hard to close off. He was disciplined about it, though. He kept their interactions brief and professional. He tipped his hat. He asked if things were quiet out at the farm. She said they were, or she said there had been a problem with the fence on the north side, or she said that Cyrus Aldgate had ridden by again, and she wished he would find a more interesting use of his time. Hunter noted these things and acted on them when action was required. He paid Aldgate a visit after the second fence incident on her property and made certain things clear in the quiet, conclusive way he had of making things clear, and otherwise kept himself behind the wall he had built. He was doing very well at this, he thought. He was doing very well right up until the night in June when she came to the jailhouse door at close to 11 at night with dried blood on her sleeve and her bonnet missing, and a look on her face that was calm in the way that people are calm when they are working very hard at it. He opened the door and stood back without a word. She came inside and sat down in the chair across from his desk. In the lamplight her face was pale and her dark auburn hair had come partly down from its pins. The blood on her sleeve was not, he could see with relief, hers. It was from a gash on her hand where she had gripped a piece of wire fencing that had given way. "Aldgate's man cut my fence," she said. "The north fence, the good section. They ran 24 head of my cattle through the gap before I got out there." He had already put on his hat. "How many horses do you have? Are any of them trail sound?" "My mare is, but I am telling you what happened, not asking you to ride out in the dark." "Miss Rourke," he looked at her directly. "Where did the cattle go?" She held his gaze for a moment, and then, unexpectedly, a breath went out of her that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but somewhere between the two, as though something she had been holding had released slightly. "North," she said, "along the creek. I followed them to the ridge and then lost them in the dark." He handed her a clean cloth from the shelf behind his desk. She looked at it, then at her hand, as if she had forgotten about the cut entirely. She pressed the cloth to it with the same brisk, practical efficiency she seemed to bring to everything. He woke Pharaoh and left him at the jailhouse, and he rode out with Sarah to the farm, and then north along the creek in the direction she described. He found the cattle at first light 22 head, milling in a shallow draw about 3 miles from her farm, and cut them loose from where they had been loosely corralled by a stand of cottonwoods in a way that suggested human assistance. He drove them back himself, while Sarah rode ahead to open the repaired gap in her fence. By the time he returned the cattle and she had counted and confirmed them, the sun was fully up and the coffee she had put on was ready. He had not expected coffee. He had not planned to stay. But she handed him a cup with the directness of someone who was not asking permission, and he took it and sat down at her kitchen table, which was a plain wooden thing scrubbed pale and smooth with use. It was a small kitchen, a clean one. She had a few pictures cut from magazines pinned to the wall near the window, and a jar with some early wildflowers on the windowsill, yellow ones, prairie buttercups, and the whole room had the feeling of a woman who was making something out of what she had, and doing it on her own terms. He noticed all of this with the detailed attention of a man who has trained himself to observe, and has not yet trained himself to stop feeling about what he observes. "Thank you," she said. She was sitting across from him and she was looking at him with the same measuring quality he had noticed the first time, but there was something added to it now, something warmer, more direct. "It is the job," he said. "It is the job to go retrieve cattle at 4 in the morning in the dark, when someone has stolen them, yes." She wrapped both hands around her cup and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have been marshal here for about 2 months. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. And in that time you have returned stolen cattle, discouraged Cyrus Aldgate from whatever he imagines himself to be doing, reduced the number of fights at the Dusty Crown to something the town considers remarkable, and I heard about the boy with the horse, Marshal Hunter. What you did for him was kind." He was not sure what to do with this. He was not accustomed to being seen, or to conversations that turned abruptly in this direction. It seemed the right thing to do. Most men in your position would have jailed him. He was 15 and hungry and scared. Jail would have made him worse. She looked at him for a long moment. "You are not what you pretend to be," she said. It was not an accusation. It was more like someone observing that the sky had gone from gray to blue, a simple, interested noting of a change in condition. He stood up. "I appreciate the coffee," he said. "I appreciate the cattle." And there it was again, that not quite laugh, that sound that made something move in him behind the wall that he immediately pressed back down. He rode back to town in the early morning light and told himself, firmly and clearly, that it meant nothing and he intended to keep it that way. He was lying to himself, and the lying was harder than it used to be. The summer came on hot and relentless, the way Kansas summers do, with a sky that bleached to white at midday and a heat that rose off the earth in visible waves. The cattle drives were at their peak, and the town of Caldwell was loud with the business of it, dusty, overworked, smelling of livestock and money, and the various entertainments that men with recently received wages sought out. Hunter worked long days and most nights, moving through the town with his particular brand of contained authority, and the job absorbed him the way he needed jobs to absorb him. He saw Sarah Rourke regularly. She came into town. They exchanged words. He went out to the farm twice more on official business, once when a pair of trail hands camped too close to her property, and once to check on a report from Mrs. Haverson that a stranger had been seen near the farm road. Neither amounted to anything serious, but he found himself manufacturing careful reasons why the visits were necessary, and in quieter moments he was honest enough with himself to be troubled by this. After the second visit, he lingered slightly longer than he needed to, watching her move through her yard with the fluid competence of a woman fully at home in her life, and something ached in him that he had not felt in years, something he had believed thoroughly dead. It was not merely attraction, though that was present too, inconveniently and with increasing stubbornness. It was something older and more dangerous, a longing for the kind of life that had color in it, that had warmth and detail and something to come home to at the end of the day beyond a small house with a broken chair and a Bible he did not read. He put it in the ground with everything else and rode back to town. Cyrus Aldgate left Caldwell in July, summoned back to Wichita on business, and the immediate pressure on Sarah's farm eased. Hunter was professionally satisfied by this and personally relieved in a way he had no business being. He wrote a full report to Sheriff Briggs detailing the fence incidents and the cattle displacement, and recommending that Aldgate's activities in the area be noted formally, and Briggs wrote back acknowledging the report with the particular brevity of a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted out of the situation and had nothing further to add. In August, there was a fire. It started in the livery on a Tuesday evening. An overturned lantern, probably, though no one ever established the cause with certainty. The fire took the livery and the building adjacent to it, which was a small leather-working shop, and threatened the dusty crown before the town turned out in sufficient numbers with enough water and enough urgency to get it under control. No one died. 3 horses were lost before the animals could be gotten out, which was a grief particular to the people who owned them. Hunter organized the firefighting effort with the same methodical steadiness he brought to everything else, and was hoarse and smoke-black and utterly exhausted by the time it was done. Sarah Rourke was in that line, passing buckets. He noticed her in the firelight at some point during the effort, her sleeves rolled up, her hair sticking to her face with sweat and ash, working with the same capable efficiency she brought to everything. And he had no time to think about it right then, but he thought about it later. She had driven in from the farm at night because she had seen the smoke, and she had joined the line without anyone asking her to, and she had stayed until it was done. Afterward, when most people had drifted away and the smoke was thinning, and the ruin of the livery was a hot, dark skeleton against the night sky, she found him standing by the water trough where he had been washing his face and hands. She held out a canteen. He took it and drank and handed it back. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes." He looked at her face, which was smudged with ash and deeply tired and entirely, uncomplicatedly present, just looking at him, genuinely asking with no angle or performance to it. "Are you?" "I am tired," she said. It was the most direct admission he had heard her make. "You did not have to come in." "Of course I did. It is my town too." He looked at the ruined livery. He was very tired and he had, temporarily, less wall than usual. He said without fully deciding to, "Where are your horses stabled now?" "Calloway's back lot." He was kind enough. She paused. "I cannot drive back tonight." "I will stay with Mrs. Haverson." He nodded. "You should sleep," she said. "I will. You will sit on that jailhouse porch until 2 in the morning because you do not sleep well, and then you will be up before 5 because you never sleep past 5. He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Mrs. Haverson's cousin lives next to the Calloway place, which is next to the jailhouse, and small towns talk Marshal Hunter." But there was something in her eyes that said she had noted it herself, had observed him, and had thought about what she observed. "You should sleep," she said again. "The town is all right." He stood there for a moment in the darkness with the smell of smoke in his clothes and the exhaustion heavy in every part of him, and the strangest feeling, which was that someone had just told him the town was all right in a tone that also meant he was all right, that he could put it down for a night, and he could not remember the last time someone had said something like that to him. He said good night. He walked back to the jailhouse. He did not sleep until 2, as she had known he would not. But when he did sleep, he slept more deeply than usual, which he noticed in the morning and filed away without examining. September brought cooler air and the winding down of the cattle drives, and with it a change in the rhythm of Caldwell. The town relaxed into itself, the cowboys moving on, the permanent residents settling back into the quieter business of getting through a winter. The general store shifted its stock toward seed and winter provisions. The church planned a harvest social. The dusty crown reduced its hours and its staff and became, for a season, almost respectable. Hunter found himself with more time on his hands than he was comfortable with, because time meant thinking, and thinking was the thing he had always tried most to avoid. He repaired things: the jailhouse roof, the broken lock on the weapons cabinet, the fence posts around the small corral out back, and he performed his daily rounds, and he wrote thorough and probably excessive reports to Sheriff Briggs, and he read by lamplight in the evenings from a small collection of books he had carried with him across several states, because he could not make himself leave them behind. He rode out to Sarah's farm in the 3rd week of September with no official reason for it. He had been honest with himself about that on the ride out. There was no fence incident, no suspicious stranger, no stolen cattle. He was simply riding out there. He told himself it was a general check on things, which was a category of activity broad enough to include almost anything. He arrived in the late afternoon when the light was golden, and the fields had the particular beauty of land that has been worked and has responded to working. She was in the barn when he arrived. doing something practical with a length of rope and what appeared to be a particularly uncooperative section of harness. She looked up when he came in, and her face did that thing it sometimes did, a quick arrangement, as if something had been there for a moment and had been set aside to make room for the more neutral expression she chose to present. "Marshal," she said. "Miss Rourke." He leaned on the barn doorframe and looked at the harness. "I can fix that if you have a leather punch." She considered him. "Third peg on the right." He came in and found the punch and sat on a hay bale and worked on the harness while she worked on her rope, and for a good 20 minutes neither of them said anything at all. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have discovered they do not need to fill space with noise. Then she said without looking up, "You rode out here for a reason." "Did I?" "You are a purposeful man. You do not make unnecessary trips." A pause. "Either something is wrong or you are learning to make unnecessary trips." He set the harness down. He looked at his hands, then at her. She was looking at him now with that direct, clear gaze, and he thought about all the things he had put in the ground and how none of them were as deep as he had thought. "My brother wrote me," he said. It was not what he had expected to say. "Thomas, in Ohio. He has a third child now, a son." He stopped. "He says the farm is doing well. He says they have been happy." She was very still. "He asks me to come home. He says there is room." He picked the harness up again, turned it in his hands. "He asks me this every year. Every year I write back that I am settled where I am, which is not precisely a lie because I am always settled somewhere. He stopped again. "You are not happy," she said quietly, not harshly, not with pity, as a statement of fact offered carefully. "I am not unhappy," he said. "I do not know that I think much about it." "You should." She set her rope down entirely and turned toward him. "You are 32 years old and you are living in a jailhouse that you keep so clean it looks like no one lives in it at all. And you mend things that belong to other people. And you spend your evenings alone. And you are the loneliest man I have seen since I buried Daniel." The directness of this struck him somewhere soft, somewhere he had thought was well defended. He did not speak. "I notice these things," she said, "because I am the loneliest woman in Caldwell and lonely people tend to recognize each other." She said it without self-pity, matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. He set the harness down carefully. He stood up. He looked at her for a long moment and she looked back and neither of them looked away. "Sarah," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and they both heard it. "Marshal," she said, which was so close to his given name and his title both that it sat between meanings in a way that made something in his chest tighten. He thought about everything he had buried. He thought about it as a deliberate act of consciousness, perhaps for the first time since he had started burying things, standing there in her barn in the September light with the smell of hay and horses around him, and the realization settling over him that the things he had buried had not actually died. They had only been waiting in the cold dark for someone with enough patience and enough genuine interest to start digging. He said, "I do not know how to be anything other than what I am." "What you are," she said carefully, "is a man who drove out to a stranger's farm at 4 in the morning to retrieve cattle that were not his responsibility, who showed mercy to a frightened boy that no one else would have, who fixed a harness for a woman he barely knows for no reason except that he could see it needed fixing." She stood up herself, and she was close enough now that he could see the particular depth of her eyes and the gravity in her face. "That is not a man with nothing left. That is a man who has had the sense to conserve what he has." He was quiet for a long time. The horses shifted in their stalls. A swallow shot through the open barn door and back out again. "I was not a good man in the war," he said. It came out rough and low, and he had not planned it, had not planned to say this to anyone, had carried it as a piece of the original burial. "I did things that the war required, and I have told myself they were necessary because they were, but telling myself something is necessary does not make it easy to carry." She did not step back. She did not fill the space with reassurances or platitudes. She stood there with him in the weight of it, and after a moment she said, "I know. You were not in the war." "No." but I know what it is to carry something you cannot set down and cannot be forgiven of because the person who might have forgiven you is dead." She looked away briefly, then back. "Daniel did not want to come west. It was my idea. I thought adventure, a different life, something bigger than what we had. He came because he loved me. And then he died out here, 3,000 miles from his family, and I have been carrying that since the summer of 1871. The barn was very quiet. He said, "It was not your fault." "No," she said, "it was not. It took me a long time to know that all the way through. I knew it in my head before I knew it in my bones." She looked at him. "The things you did in the war, you were a soldier, Marshal Hunter. You were following orders in the middle of a hell that no one who was not there can fully imagine. That does not mean you were not changed by it, but it does not make you a bad man. A bad man would not be troubled by it." He breathed. He breathed like he was breathing for the first time in a significant while. "I am troubled by a great many things," he said. "I know." And there it was again, that honesty, that directness, looking at him like she could see through the wall to everything he had buried behind it. "I think that is what I find." She stopped, looked briefly at the floor, then back up with a kind of decision in her expression. "That is what I find compelling about you." The word landed in the air between them. Neither of them moved. "I should not have said that," she said. "That is more than the situation requires." "No," he said. "You should not have to keep what you think to yourself on my account." She looked at him. He took a step closer, not a large step, just a closing of a little of the space between them, and he was close enough now to see the slight quickening in her expression, the awareness. He said, "I have been thinking about you since the night you came to the jailhouse with that cut on your hand. I have been attempting with limited success not to." Her chin lifted slightly. "Limited success," she repeated. "Very limited." The corners of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more internal than that, something she was holding. "I have had the same problem," she said. He reached out and with a deliberateness that was almost formal put his hand over hers where it rested at her side. Her hand was warm and capable and calloused, and she turned it and took his, and they stood there holding on to each other in the barn, while the September light changed angle outside, and the world continued its business at a respectful distance. "I do not know how to do this," he said. "I do not remember how either," she said. "I think we can manage." He walked back to his horse in the early dusk with her standing at the barn door watching him go, and when he looked back at the gate she raised her hand in a small gesture, and he lifted his in return, and he rode back to Caldwell with the peculiar and completely foreign sensation of something growing where nothing had grown in a very long time. He did not try to bury it. He noticed this. He noticed the difference between this feeling and the feelings he had chosen to bury before. And the difference was that this one, when he reached toward it instead of away, felt like oxygen rather than like danger. He was cautious about it. He was not a man who trusted quickly or easily. But he did not bury it. In October he began calling on her properly, which in Caldwell in 1873 meant that he rode out on Sunday afternoons and sat with her in her kitchen or on her porch, and they talked. They talked the way two people talk when they have both been quiet for a long time and have found each other unexpectedly, with a kind of careful hunger, covering ground, learning the shape of each other's lives and thoughts. She told him about Missouri, about her family there, about the sister who had written twice a year since Daniel died and who had, in her most recent letter, mentioned a visit come spring. He told her about Ohio, about Thomas and Ruth and the three small children, James and Alina and the new one, Benjamin, and about the farm by the creek and the way it looked in the fall and the way he had been unable to stay there and had spent the years since trying to understand whether he regretted leaving. "Do you," she asked, "regret it?" "I think I regret not knowing how to stay," he said. "Whether I could have been happy there if I had been capable of it, I do not know. I was not capable of much for a long time. And now," he looked at her across the table, with the coffee between them and the late afternoon light on her face, "I am learning what I am capable of," he said. She held his gaze. "So am I," she said quietly. He held her hand on the porch that afternoon when they were watching the sun go down, and she leaned against his arm and he did not move away, and the sky turned pink and orange, and then deep blue, and the stars came out over the Kansas prairie, and neither of them felt like talking anymore and neither of them needed to. He kissed her for the first time in November, on the porch after one of his Sunday visits, when the air had gone cold enough that she had brought out a blanket, and they had been sitting under it together with the frontier stars blazing above them, talking about nothing in particular, about a book he had been reading, about a letter from her sister, about the way the cold smelled different here than it had in Missouri or Ohio. He had turned to say something, and she had turned at the same moment, and they were very close, and the moment balanced there for one precise second before he put his hand against her cheek and kissed her. She was still for a single breath, and then she kissed him back, warm and real and unhurried, and when they separated she looked at him with an expression that undid something in him that he had not even known was still holding tight. He was not a man who cried. He had not cried since 1863 and was not about to start now. But there was a quality of release in him in that moment, a very old tension letting go, and he sat there with her hand in his in the cold dark and felt it and did not turn away from it. "All right," she said softly, just that. "All right," he agreed. He told her, carefully and over time, about the war. Not all at once. It was not the kind of thing that came out all at once, and he would not have trusted a woman who wanted it all at once, who approached his damage with a kind of greedy urgency as if grief were entertainment. Sarah did not do that. She listened when he chose to speak, and she waited when he did not, and she asked questions that were never demanding, that were simply openings. "Here is a door if you want to walk through it." He walked through it slowly over the winter months. The cold settled over Caldwell, and the town contracted to its winter self, quieter and closer, and the Sunday visits and the occasional shared meals extended further into evenings, and he told her things he had not said aloud to another person since before the war. He told her about his unit, the men he had known, and the men he had watched die, and the particular helplessness of being 20 years old in the middle of a slaughter, and being asked to keep walking forward. He told her about the morning in Georgia when he had done something that the war required of him and had walked away from it and had understood in his body, with a finality that no argument could touch, that the person he had been before was not coming back. She listened. She did not flinch. She did not offer him absolution, because she understood that absolution was not what he needed and could not be given by someone who was not there. What she offered was presence, the consistent, warm, unfrightened fact of her being there while he talked, not running from what he showed her, not reducing it to a lesson or a comfort, just holding it with him. One evening in January he was sitting at her kitchen table, having told her something about the winter of 1864 that he had never said aloud in 8 years, and she had been quiet for a moment, and then she had reached across the table and taken both his hands in hers, and she said, "You have been carrying that alone for a very long time." "Yes. You do not have to carry it alone anymore," she said. "I am not going anywhere." He looked down at their joined hands. He looked up at her face. He said, "I know that, I believe it, which is," he stopped, tried again. "I believe you. I do not say that to many people. I do not believe many people when they say it." "I know," she said. "I am not easy to be close to," he said. "I am aware of this. There are things in me that are still not Marshall." She squeezed his hands. "I have a farm that has been on the edge of failing for 3 years. I buried my husband on this land. I have been alone long enough to understand that alone is not a permanent condition if you make different choices." She looked at him steadily. "I am not looking for an easy man. I am looking for a true one." Something shifted in him then in the deepest places, the places where everything had been buried in the cold and the dark, and he felt with a clarity that surprised him that things were coming back to life down there, not all at once, not without difficulty, but steadily and unmistakably, like the first things that grow when the snow melts on ground that has been frozen all winter. Slow and tentative, and then, suddenly, everywhere. He got down on one knee in the kitchen of her farmhouse on a February evening in 1874, with the winter wind working at the corners of the house and the lamp burning warm on the table between them. He did not have a ring yet. He would go to Wichita for one and did the following week. But he could not wait for a ring because he had waited long enough for everything, and this was not a thing he wanted to wait for any longer. He said, "Sarah, I cannot promise you that I am fully repaired or that I ever will be. I can promise you that I am trying, which is something I have not been able to say with honesty in quite a long time. I can promise you that I have not felt anything as real as you in years, possibly in my entire life. I can promise you that I will show up and I will stay and I will work on this land with you and I will not leave. And if something is broken, I will fix it. And if something is too broken to fix, I will sit with you in the middle of it." He paused. "I can promise you all of that. That is what I have." She had her hand over her mouth, which he had never seen her do before. He had never seen her at a loss, not once. Her eyes were very bright. "Yes," she said. Her voice was rough with it. "Marshal Hunter, yes." He rose from his knee, and she came toward him from her chair at the same moment, and he held her, her face against his shoulder, his arms around her with a sureness that surprised him. He had expected to feel uncertain, to feel like a man moving carefully across uncertain ground, but instead it felt exactly like what it was, which was the rightest thing he had done in as long as he could remember. He held her and he breathed and he felt, in a way that he could only describe to himself as a kind of resurrection, that the things he had buried were not dead. He had buried every soft thing in himself. He had been thorough and disciplined about it, had compacted the grief and the tenderness and the hope down into the deepest parts of himself where he would not have to encounter them daily. But Sarah Rourke had dug. Not with impatience or force, not with the pickaxe of demand or the shovel of scrutiny, but with the slow, steady, daily insistence of a woman who had herself survived enough to understand what survival had taken from the person beside her, and who believed, with a quiet and stubborn faith, that what was buried was not gone. She had dug until she found something still alive. And he, standing there in the cold light with his arms around her, and everything he had suppressed for years making its careful way back to the surface, was grateful beyond the capacity of language that she had not stopped. They were married in the Caldwell church on a Saturday in March of 1874, on a day when the wind had decided, for once, to behave itself, and the sky was the clear, washed blue that Kansas shows off in early spring. Mrs. Haverson cried throughout the ceremony with the enthusiasm of a woman who had been emotionally invested in this development for months. Young Pharaoh was there in his best shirt, which was noticeably too large for him in the shoulders, and which he had ironed with such dedication that it had a grid of creases on the front. Calloway shut the store for the afternoon and brought a cake he had organized with Bert's wife, a woman of legendary baking abilities who had risen to the occasion. Thomas sent a letter from Ohio that arrived 2 days before the wedding, which was a kind of minor miracle given the reliability of the postal service, in which he said he was glad beyond words, and that he hoped they would come east sometime when they could manage it, and that Ruth said to tell Sarah she was welcome to the family and the farm, and to come any time. Hunter read this letter 3 times. He read it without the usual feeling of dislocation that news from home produced in him. He read it and felt, for the first time in 8 years, like a man who had a home to refer to. The farm changed when he moved in. Not in its essential character, it remained Sarah's farm in the most fundamental sense, the land she had chosen to stay on, the ground that held Daniel Rourke's memory as well as their beginning. Hunter was careful about this, understood it instinctively. He did not arrive and rearrange things or assert ownership in ways that would have overwritten what had come before. He arrived and he worked, which was what the farm needed and what he had to give. He built a new section on the barn in April, a structure that was considerably more solid than what had been there before. He repaired the north fence line properly, with good posts set deep enough to last through a Kansas winter, which was a satisfaction that was only partly about fences. He improved the irrigation arrangement for the kitchen garden with a small channel that Sarah had been thinking about for 2 years and had not had the manpower to execute. And when he finished it and the water ran properly, she came and stood next to him and watched it with such pure, unguarded pleasure that he felt something warm and entirely new open in his chest. He kept the marshal's position. Caldwell was still his responsibility, and the town needed him, and he was good at the job in ways that were hard to replicate. He rode into town each morning and back each evening, and the life had a shape to it that felt, increasingly, like abundance rather than confinement. He came home to a lamp in the window and the smell of food and Sarah at the end of the day, and these things, which he had trained himself not to need, turned out to be more necessary to him than he had known. They argued because they were both strong-willed people and because living in close proximity to another person always eventually produces friction, and their arguments were brisk and honest and resolved because neither of them was willing to carry things. They had both carried enough and knew the cost of it. She argued with more words than he did, which was not difficult because his threshold for words was low, and he argued with a stubbornness that she said was like arguing with a stone wall, except that stone walls occasionally had a point. He found this description accurate and not entirely unappealing. He told her in the summer of 1874 about a specific night in Georgia. He had never told anyone about this particular night. He told her on the porch in the dark, after she had been reading and had fallen asleep against his shoulder and woken up again, and there was a quality of honesty that the middle of the night produced in him that broad daylight did not. He told her all of it, and she listened, and she held his hand, and when he was finished she said, "That was terrible. I am sorry you had to do that. I am sorry you have been carrying it alone." And then, after a moment, "You are still a good man. You were a good man who was in a terrible situation. I know the difference." He had needed, it turned out, someone to know the difference. He had not known he needed it until she said it. He sat with it for a long time afterward, and the thing did not exactly disappear. It would not entirely disappear, but it became lighter, the way things become lighter when they are shared. The grief of it was still real. But it did not feel, after that night, like a verdict. The summer brought a particular kind of joy. He had not expected joy. He had expected contentment, which was what he had been working toward, and contentment arrived reliably. But joy was something additional, something he had not put in his calculations, and it arrived in unexpected forms in the sound of Sarah laughing at something he said, in the way she looked at him across the dinner table with a warmth so direct and uncomplicated that it still surprised him every time. In the simple fact of sharing a bed with someone and waking up in the morning and finding her there, her dark hair spread on the pillow, her breathing slow and even, the room full of ordinary morning light. He was not entirely fixed. He wanted to be clear about this with himself, because he was not a man who had patience for self-deception. There were still nights when sleep failed him, and he sat on the porch in the dark working through things that would not settle. There were still moments when a loud sound produced a reaction that was years out of date, a physical memory of war that his body had kept when his mind had tried to move on. There were still corners in him where the burials were deep enough that he was not sure anything would ever grow there again. But Sarah understood this. She did not require him to be completed. She required him to be honest and present and trying, and he was all of those things with a diligence that surprised him sometimes. He had not known, until he had a reason to try, how much trying he was capable of. In the autumn of 1874, she told him she was expecting. She told him on a September evening on the porch where so many of their important moments had taken place, and his first reaction was a stillness that she watched carefully, trying to read it. And then he stood up and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and her cheek and then her mouth with a tenderness that had been thoroughly underground for years and was now unquestionably, robustly alive. "Good," he said. His voice was rough. "That is very good. You are going to be a wonderful father," she said. He shook his head slightly. "I do not know about that." "I do," she said with the directness that he had long since stopped being surprised by and had become simply dependent on. "I have watched you with the Haverson children and with young Pharaoh, who worships you and probably wishes you would adopt him, and with that boy whose horse you took back without jail. You know how to be gentle with people who need it. You always have, you just forgot for a while." He thought about this. About the gentleness he had buried, which had seemed to him the most dangerous thing, that the war had taken his capacity for softness and weaponized it, had made him understand that soft things could be used against you, and so the only defense was to have none. He had been wrong about this. Not wrong that the war had tried to take it, but wrong that letting it be taken was the only response. The softness, buried deep and long and thoroughly, had not died. Sarah had dug until she found it still alive, and it had come back up into the light changed by its time underground but not destroyed. He was going to be a father. He sat with this fact in the way he sat with all the things that mattered to him now, directly, without flinching, letting himself feel the full weight and warmth of it. He wrote to Thomas that night. Thomas wrote back by Christmas with a letter so full of joy for his brother that it made Sarah, reading it over Hunter's shoulder at the kitchen table, put her hand on his back and lean against him, and he let her and he breathed, and the kitchen was warm. The winter of 1874 to 1875 was cold but not brutal. There had been worse winters and there would be worse still, but this one was manageable, and the farm's preparations were better than they had ever been because Hunter was thorough about preparation in a way that had been developed by years of needing to be ready for the worst. The cattle were fat from a good summer. The wood supply was extensive. The root cellar was full. Sarah spent the cold months on the domestic preparations that the approaching baby required, and Hunter watched her with a fascination that he made no attempt to conceal, moving around their home with new purpose. Her voice when she was alone slightly different from when she knew he was listening, as if she was already talking to a person who was not yet there. He learned in the process of watching her things about how a person inhabits a life with full commitment, something he had never done before, having always kept one part of himself outside and uninvested, ready to move on. Sarah did not live like that. She lived with every part of herself present and engaged, and this, more than anything she said, was the lesson he absorbed most deeply that winter. You could not be fully alive in a life you were only half in. He had been half in everything for years. He was not going to do that anymore. Their son was born in April of 1875, on a day when it rained for the first time in 2 weeks and the air smelled of wet earth and new grass. He was a solid, loud, clearly vigorous infant who arrived after a labor that was difficult but not dangerous, attended by the doctor from Caldwell and Mrs. Haverson, who was quietly indispensable. Hunter stayed closer than was probably expected of men in this time and situation. He was not the kind of man who could be told to go wait somewhere. And when the doctor put his son in his arms, he stood there and looked at this small, furious, entirely new person and felt something open in him so large that he was briefly unable to speak. They named him Daniel Thomas Hunter, the first name for Sarah's late husband, a choice Hunter had proposed himself, which had made Sarah look at him with an expression that contained a whole world of gratitude, and the second for his brother in Ohio. They called him Danny from the first week, which was not a formal diminutive, but simply what came out when you were talking to him, which he seemed to find acceptable. Pharaoh, when he met the baby for the first time, held him with the terrified reverence of a young man who has never held anything this important, and Danny looked up at his enormous, freckled face with the severe analytical expression that newborns have, and Pharaoh said in a whisper, "He is very serious, ma'am," and Sarah said, "He takes after his father," and Hunter, standing behind her, said, "That is not entirely a compliment," which made Sarah laugh and Pharaoh grin and Danny make a small, imperious sound that seemed to endorse the general atmosphere. The spring and summer of 1875 were, by any measurement that Hunter would have rejected 8 years ago as sentimental and unreliable, the best months of his life. The farm was doing well better than it had ever done, with 2 people working it with the combined efficiency of complementary skills and the kind of motivation that comes from working for something genuinely yours. The cattle numbers were up. The wheat was good. The kitchen garden was the best Sarah had ever managed, partly because of the irrigation channel, and partly because she now had Danny's naptime hours to work in it without interruption. He rode into Caldwell each morning and did his job with the same steady competence, but the job no longer had to be everything. He was glad of it, grateful for the purpose and the way it kept him engaged with the world, but it was a part of his life now rather than the whole of it, and the difference was immense. He came home in the evenings to a house that was alive, to the smell of supper and the sound of Danny making the sounds of a person discovering the world. Each week a new sound, a new expression, a new incomprehensible statement made with complete conviction. And to Sarah, who moved through the evenings with an ease and happiness that he watched and was sometimes simply arrested by, stopped in the middle of whatever he was doing by the fact of her. She caught him watching her one evening in June, standing in the kitchen doorway while she was at the stove, and she turned and said, "What? You are very beautiful," he said. He was not a man who said things like this easily or often, and she knew it, and the effect was accordingly larger than if he had said it every day. She looked at him for a moment with those warm brown eyes. "You are going to make me burn the beans," she said. "The beans can survive it." She laughed and turned back to the stove, and he came across the kitchen and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him. And they stood there with the evening coming in through the window, and Danny making small noises of self-satisfaction in his cradle across the room. And the beans did not burn. And the moment was ordinary in the way that the best moments are, unremarkable from the outside, irreplaceable from the inside. Cyrus Aldgate reappeared in Caldwell in the summer of 1875, which Hunter had half expected. The man returned ostensibly on cattle business, but he was the kind of person whose grudges had a long half-life, and who found it difficult to accept the conclusion of a situation that had not gone his way. He came into town, noted the changes, the new marshal who was married and settled, and clearly not going anywhere, and visited the dusty Crown, and said some things about Sarah that were disrespectful and inaccurate, which reached Hunter's ears by the following morning with the efficiency of small-town gossip. Hunter went to the dusty Crown that morning and found Aldgate there with coffee and the remnants of his breakfast. He sat down across from him without being invited, and he looked at the man for a long moment in the way he had of looking at people when he was being direct and wanted no confusion about it. He said, "You will not speak about my wife in that manner again, in this town or anywhere that reaches back to this town. I want that understood clearly." Aldgate looked at him with the calculation of a man running odds. He found in Hunter's face what most people eventually found, that there was no theater in it, no performance, no invitation to negotiation. He said, "Now see here, Marshal, I am not here for an explanation," Hunter said. "I am here for your word." Aldgate gave it, in the way that men give their word when the alternative is visible and unpleasant. Hunter stood, nodded, put his hat back on, and left. He did not think it necessary to mention this visit to Sarah, not because he was protecting her from information. He did not believe in that, but because it had been handled and there was nothing further she needed to do about it. When she asked him later that week if something had happened, because she had heard a version of the dusty Crown exchange from Mrs. Haverson's cousin, he told her the truth, and she looked at him with that particular expression that was more than the words required, that warm and specific regard that he had learned to live on, and she said, "Thank you. He will not bother you again." "I know," she said. "I have known for a while now that things that used to bother me have stopped being able to reach me." She paused. because they would have to get through you first and you are effectively impassable. He considered this. I am not sure that is the most romantic description I have received. You have not received many, she pointed out. No, he agreed, which makes the ones I have received more notable. She smiled at him, the full, unguarded smile that he had only come to see gradually, that had appeared more and more as the months passed, as if it were something she had been keeping in reserve until she was sure of him. He was very sure he had never seen anything better than Sarah Rourke smiling at him like that. Aldgate left Caldwell before the end of the week and did not return, which Hunter found professionally satisfying and personally pleasing, and did not think much further about. The autumn of 1875 was golden and still and impossibly beautiful, one of those Kansas falls that make you understand why people came out here and stayed despite everything. The sky, a deep, constant blue, the grasses burned golden by the early frosts, the light at a perfect, permanent-feeling slant that made everything it touched look valuable. Hunter would sometimes stop in the middle of some piece of work on the farm and just look at it, the landscape, the space, the particular quality of the light, and feel something that he had buried along with everything else, which was the capacity to find the world beautiful. It came back, that capacity, as the other things came back slowly, incrementally, occasionally arriving all at once and startling him with its intensity. He found things beautiful now with a regularity that would have embarrassed him, he thought, 10 years ago. The way the prairie looked after rain, the sound of Danny's laughter, which he had achieved in earnest in September and deployed constantly and with great evident satisfaction. The lamp in the window when he rode in from town in the evenings, that small warm light visible from the road, which meant everything it meant. Thomas and Ruth brought their children out on a visit in October, which was a journey of considerable distance and some difficulty, and which Thomas had been proposing for 2 years and finally accomplished. The 3 Hunter children, James was 8, Eleanor was 6, and Benjamin was 14 months, descended on the farm with the particular enthusiasm of children who have been cooped up with their parents for a very long week of travel, and Danny, who was 6 months old and deeply unimpressed by everything that was not directly related to his immediate needs, regarded his cousins with the expression of a judge hearing a case he has already decided. Hunter watched his brother on the first evening of the visit, sitting at Sarah's table and passing dishes around and talking in the easy, warm way that Thomas had always been able to talk, and felt the last of something, some final long-held piece of distance or self-exile give way. He was here. He had arrived, not just in Caldwell, not just in the farmhouse, but in his own life with his own people, with all the soft things he had buried coming back up one by one into the light. Thomas, who had known him before and after, put his hand on his shoulder that evening when the children were in bed, and Sarah was talking with Ruth by the fire, and said quietly, "It is good to see you, Marshal. It is really good to see you." Hunter looked at him, his younger brother, gray at the temples himself now, his face kind and familiar, the person who had stayed home and kept the faith and written every year without requiring anything in return. "It is good to be seen," Hunter said. They shook hands, and Thomas, who had more feelings than Hunter about most things, briefly gripped his brother's hand with both of his before letting go. The winter of 1875 was more severe. That was the Kansas cycle, a manageable year followed by something that required every preparation you had made. The temperature dropped hard in January and stayed down, and the farm was tested in the ways that farms are tested in a brutal winter. A section of roof on the barn needed emergency repair in a wind that was cold enough to be serious work. 2 of the cattle were lost to the cold despite their best efforts. The well froze once, briefly, and was recovered. Hunter worked through all of it with the methodical endurance that the war had given him and that the farm had found a better use for, and Sarah worked alongside him in the way she had always worked, directly, capably, without complaint and without performance. Danny did not know it was a hard winter. He was cheerful and opinionated about it, and his company through the cold months was, Hunter reflected, something he had not known he was capable of needing. This small person who had inherited his mother's directness and his father's particular brand of stubbornness, and was applying both to the challenging project of learning to do everything. Hunter sat with him on the floor in the evenings and built simple structures from the wooden blocks Thomas had sent from Ohio, and Danny systematically demolished them with a satisfaction that was deeply relatable, and Sarah watched them from across the room with an expression that made everything, the cold, the lost cattle, the frozen well, all of it entirely, unambiguously worth it. Spring came as it always does in Kansas, abruptly and with conviction, the snow going off the ground in a matter of days and the prairie turning from brown to green with a speed that still surprised him every year. The farm woke up. The cattle were thin from winter but sound. The wheat went in on time. The kitchen garden was planned and planted with Danny supervising from a blanket on the ground, issuing opinions about where things should go that were colorful if not particularly practical. In April, exactly a year after Danny's birth, Sarah told him she was expecting again. He was not surprised exactly, they had been hoping, but it settled over him with a warmth that surprised him in its freshness, as if the feeling were entirely new, which he supposed it partly was because every version of this was new. He held her hands across the kitchen table and said, "How are you feeling?" "Very well," she said. "Better than last time at the start." "Good." He looked at her. "I would like a daughter," he said. "If you have any influence over such things," she laughed, "I will mention it to the relevant parties. I would also accept another son." "That is generous of you." "I am a generous man," he said. "I have been told." She looked at him with the smile that was entirely his, the private one, the full one. "By whom?" "By my wife," he said. "She has excellent judgment." She squeezed his hands. "She certainly does," she said. The second child was a daughter, born in November of 1876 on a day that began with frost on the grass and ended with a clear night of stars so dense and brilliant that they seemed like something out of a promise. They named her Clara Ruth Hunter, Clara for a grandmother who had died when Hunter was 7 and whose name he had carried in a quiet place all his life, and Ruth for his sister-in-law and for the value of the name, which meant something worth keeping. Danny was 18 months old and regarded his sister with a complex and evolving set of feelings that ranged from fascination to proprietary concern to occasional loud objection. And then gradually, as she became a person capable of responding to him, to the beginning of a devotion that Hunter watched with recognition, because it was exactly how he had felt about Thomas, once, before the war had come and complicated everything. The farm grew. They added a section to the house in the spring of 1877, 2 new rooms, properly built, which Hunter had planned through the winter with a precision that Sarah said was excessive, but which she also photographed in her mind, because watching him fully engaged with something he was building was one of her private pleasures. He built it with help from 2 men from town, one of whom was Pharaoh, who had developed an unexpected talent for carpentry, and who worked with the concentrated intensity of a young man determined to prove himself to someone whose opinion he valued. "You could build anything," Sarah told Hunter when the rooms were finished and they were standing in what would be Danny's room, looking at the way it caught the afternoon light. "I could not have built it without Pharaoh," he said. "Pharaoh is skilled," she said. "You are something different," she looked at him. "You make things last." He looked at the room, the solid walls, the well-fitted window frame, the floor that had been laid with care. He thought about what she meant, and he thought it was probably one of the better things anyone had said about him. Caldwell continued to grow through these years. The cattle drives continued on the Kishom Trail. The town's population increased. New buildings went up on the main street. A second church was organized by a group of settlers who preferred their theology slightly differently arranged. A small school opened in 1876 in which Clara would eventually spend several years. And the Dusty Crown changed hands and became, under new management, a slightly more respectable establishment that sold food as well as liquor, and closed at a reasonable hour most nights. Hunter's relationship with the town was one of the most settled and uncomplicated parts of his life. He was respected genuinely and specifically, not in the way that fear creates respect, but in the way that consistent fairness and reliability create it, over time, in a community that has seen enough of the alternative to understand the value of what it has. He was good to people who needed help and firm with people who needed firmness, and he kept his word so reliably that his word had become, in Caldwell, a kind of currency that people trusted completely. Farrow became, over these years, more than a deputy. He became a friend, which surprised Hunter more than it probably should have. The young man had grown into himself through his 20s with a steadiness that Hunter had watched with quiet satisfaction, and he had the gift, which Hunter valued highly, of being able to sit in a companionable silence without needing to fill it. They sat on the jailhouse porch many afternoons saying very little and working through whatever needed working through, and it was, Hunter thought, one of the better things the job had given him. On a Sunday evening in the fall of 1877, Hunter sat on the porch of the farmhouse that was now significantly larger and substantially more solid than it had been when he arrived, with Clara asleep against his chest in the warm, solid way that small children sleep when they are fully comfortable, and Danny on the steps below him occupied with an elaborate private game involving a set of wooden soldiers and a complex geopolitical situation he was narrating quietly to himself. And Sarah in the chair beside him with her tea and a letter from her sister in Missouri, who was coming to visit in the spring. The sunset was doing what Kansas sunsets do in October, which is to commit fully and without restraint to being magnificent. The whole western sky a deep burning gold fading into rose, and then the particular blue that comes just before dark, the first stars appearing at the top of the sky, the air cool and smelling of grass and distance. Hunter looked at all of it. He looked at Clara's sleeping face against his chest, her small hands curled, her breath perfectly even. He looked at Danny below him, entirely absorbed in his own small world. He looked at Sarah, who was reading her letter with a small smile that meant the news was good, the dark auburn hair, more familiar to him now than his own face, catching the last of the light. He thought about Ohio, and about the creek by the farm, and about the version of himself who had sat beside that creek, and understood that he was broken in ways he did not know how to fix, and had walked away rather than inflict the damage on people he loved. He thought about all the years of moving, the different towns, the different jailhouses, the jobs that kept him forward-facing enough to avoid looking inward. He thought about the day he had ridden into Caldwell and walked the length of the main street, noting everything, burying everything, and had passed a woman outside the general store holding a bolt of blue cotton fabric with an expression of private argument on her face. He thought about a barn in September light and a hand that had turned and taken his. He thought about the things he had buried and about what it meant that they were alive, that they had always been alive, waiting in the cold dark for someone to dig. "You are quiet," Sarah said, without looking up from her letter. "I am often quiet," he said. "You are a different kind of quiet right now." She lowered the letter and looked at him. "Good or bad?" "Good," he said. "Very good." He adjusted Clara slightly, carefully, so as not to wake her. "I was thinking about something you said in the barn the first autumn," she thought back. "Which thing?" "You said I was not what I pretended to be." She looked at him steadily. "I stand by it." "I know," he met her eyes. "I am glad you did not believe the pretending. I am glad you kept looking." She held his gaze for a long, warm moment. The stars were coming out in earnest now, the Milky Way beginning its slow revelation overhead, the way it revealed itself every clear night over the Kansas prairie with a vastness that made you understand why people had been using it for navigation since the beginning of human time. "I would have kept looking," she said simply, "for as long as it took." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, the warm and capable hand that he knew now as well as he knew anything, and she laced her fingers through his in the way she had since that first time in the barn, and they sat there together in the falling dark, while Danny dispatched his wooden soldiers with narrated authority, and Clara breathed her perfect sleeping breaths against his chest, and the stars came out overhead with the complete and ancient indifference of stars, which know nothing of human grief and human repair and human love, and which shine equally on all of it, and were shining now on two people who had found each other in the ruins of what they had each survived and had decided, against considerable evidence and with full information, to stay. He had buried every soft thing in himself. He had done it carefully and thoroughly and with the best of intentions, because the war had convinced him that soft things were liabilities, and that a man without them was a man who could not be broken. He had been wrong about all of it. The soft things, buried, had not died. They had only waited. And Sarah Rourke had dug until she found them still alive, had dug with patience and directness, and an unfrightened willingness to see what was there. And the things she had found had come back into the light changed but whole, grown strange and strong and permanent in the dark. And they were his, and he kept them, and he intended to keep them for the rest of his life. The wind moved through the tall grass beyond the fence line with a sound like water. Danny finished his battle and came up the steps and leaned against his father's knee with a sleepiness he would not yet admit to. Clara turned her face slightly in her sleep against his chest. Sarah was still, her hand in his, watching the stars appear. Marshal Hunter sat in the September dark of his own life, which was full and real and imperfect and entirely, specifically, irrevocably his, and found that he had nothing to bury. Not one thing. Everything was above ground and breathing. Everything was present and accounted for, and the quiet in him was no longer the quiet of emptiness but the quiet of something that had come to rest. He was home. He had not expected to be home. He had not known that home was something he still had the architecture for, after everything. But here it was, a farmhouse with new rooms and a crooked porch rail he kept meaning to fix, a kitchen that smelled of bread and coffee, a small corral that needed a new post on the western side, 2 children who were entirely themselves, and a woman who had looked at him on a main street in Caldwell when he was as closed as a man could get, and had decided, without evident hesitation, that the doors were worth the patience of opening. Here it was, all of it. The only burial he intended to do for the rest of his days was the ordinary one, seeds going into the ground each spring, knowing that they would come back.